Hello again. I'm going to be reading Evolution of Calpurnia Tate. Again, only made it 5 chapters last time. So, yeah, I'm just going to start. This is Chapter 6 Music Lessons. A quote from The Origin of Species. It is most difficult always to remember that the increase of every living being is constantly being checked by unperceived, injurious agencies. End quote. The summer wore on, and I found respite in the coolness of the river and the dimness of Granddaddy's laboratory. My notebook progressed nicely, each page filled with many questions, an occasional answer, and clumsy illustrations of various plants and animals. But despite my pressing new activities, I was not excused from my music lessons. Our piano teacher, Miss Brown, looked like a thin, dry stick, but she could swing her ruler with plenty of juice when she thought no one was looking. Sometimes she would smack my knuckles so hard that my hands crashed in the keys, causing an ugly, dissonant chord to detonate in the middle of the piece. I wonder if my mother, sitting on the other side of the closed pocket doors with her sewing basket, ever puzzled over these frightful noises. For some reason, I didn't tell her about Miss Brown's assault. Why didn't I? I guess I had the sense that something shameful on my part, I don't know what, invited those pedagogic outrages. And it's true that Miss Brown did not attack me at random. Her violence boiled over when I got lost picking my way through the thicket of notes I'd been traversing without mistake all week long. Of course, the hovering ruler didn't help. I was the worst kind of coward. I seethed in silence and never said anything to anybody. And why did only Harry and I have to suffer through these wretched, weekly imposition of culture? My other brothers were free and clear. I learned to play Mr. Stephen Foster for father and Vivaldi for granddaddy, who was also partial to Mozart. He would sit in the parlor, sometimes reading, sometimes sitting with his eyes closed, for as long as I would play. Mother was partial to Chopin. Miss Brown was partial to scales. Later, there were Miss. Nah. Later, there were Mr. Scott Joplin's rags, which I learned for myself. They set Mother's teeth on edge, but I didn't care. It was the best. Nah. It was the best music my brothers and I had ever heard, with gorgeous cascading chords and an electrifying, ragged timing, which compelled the audience to get up and dance. Sorry. All of my brothers came running when I struck up the opening bars to the Maple Leaf Rag. They lurched so wildly around the parlor that Mother feared for the very pictures on the wall. Later we got a gramophone, and then I could dance too. My younger brothers adored running the machine and begged to take a turn, but you had to watch them. They were murder on the crank. Jim Bowie's favorite tune was Kitten on the Keys. He'd manhandle one of the beleaguered cats onto the keyboard and coax it with a scrap of ham to walk back and forth. JB thought it was a terrific joke. When you're 5 years old, I guess it is. It predictably drove Mother up the wall, and me too, though I'd never admit it, which of course added to JB's pleasure. Mother frequently had to resort to a couple of tablespoons of her Lydia Pinkhams. Slow Ross once asked Mother if I would also get to drink Lydia Pinkhams when I grew up to be a lady, and she replied mysteriously, I hope Callie won't need it. Viola would sing alto with me in the kitchen to Hard times come again no more. But she refused to listen to Mr. Scott Joplin. Music for savages, she sniffed, which perplexed me. It came time for Miss Brown to present her piano students at a recital held every year at the Confederate Heroes Hall in Lockhart. For the first time, Miss Brown deemed me accomplished enough to be included on the program. To be truthful, it's just that I couldn't talk my way out of it for another year. Harry had performed for 6 years in a row and told me it was a snap. All you had to do was avoid staring into the gas footlights, since the night, yeah, since the light might blind you, and you could pitch off the stage. Also, I had to memorize a piece of music. Miss Brown gave me Beethoven's Ecossaise in G, which, strangely, had chords not unlike the Joplin rags. Oh, how the ruler twitched with aggravation. Wrist down, fingers up, tempo, tempo, tempo. Crack. I learned that piece in record time, and soon I was playing it in my sleep. It goes without saying that I grew to hate it. My best friend, Lula Gates, had to memorize a piece that was twice as long as mine, but she was 10 times a better player than I. For the great occasion, Mother made me a new white broderie anglaise dress with many layers of start, stiff, scratchy petticoats. This was no corset, but it definitely ranked as a form of torture. I complained at length and clawed savagely at my legs. I also had a brand new pair of pale cream kid boots. They took forever to close with a hook, but once on, they were fine looking, and I secretly admired them. Miss Brown taught me how to curtsy, holding my dress out sideways and dipping at the knees. No, no, she said. Don't grab your skirt like some clodhopper. Think of making wings like an angel, like this. Now sink. Slowly. Don't plummet, child. Not a rock. She made me practice many times before she was satisfied. Then we had to deal with the matter of my hair. Oh boy. Mother had finally noticed that I seemed to have less hair than expected, but I explained that it had snowed so badly over the summer, what with the terrible sticker burrs, that I had been forced to chop out the rat's nests, and then cut a smidgen more to even everything up. Mother's expression grew beady at this, but she didn't say anything to me. She called for Viola to help. Together they spent a good hour brushing and twisting and parlaying as if I weren't even in the room. I didn't know you could spend so much time on hairstyles. Of course, I couldn't protest too much, because we all understood that this was my punishment for hacking away at it, and only fitting too. I forgot to say that I was going live on Twitter. Give me 1 second. And there we go. Oops. Alright. Let's get back to the trip. Then they slathered me with Peabody's finest hair food, guaranteed to produce lustrous locks and set me out in the sun to bake for yet another hour with this revolting sulfur grease on my head. This, I thought, this is what ladies go through. The one thing that made it bearable was that Granddaddy took pity on my wretched state and bought me one of his books, Fascinating Flora and Fauna of the Antipodes. The picture of the kangaroo showed a baby peeking out of its pouch. Question for the notebook. Why don't people have pouches? Such a convenient way to keep a baby at hand. I tried to picture mother with JB in a pouch. Answer? He'd never fit under a corset. I yearned to see a kangaroo, and a platypus, a mammal that looked like a bizarre cross between, oh, say, an otter and a duck. True. Since I'd been lucky enough to see a hippopotamus in a touring circus in Austin, maybe my wishes weren't so outlandish. I contemplated my chances and fanned a dim ember of hope in my heart as I sat in the sun, reeking like a giant match. Finally, they put me in the hip bath and took turns pouring buckets of water over me. Then they scoured my head clean and tied up my hair in ringlets with cotton rags that stuck out all over like a frightful job of bandaging. I smelled like brimstone and looked like a casualty from the war. I was an apparition from hell. Well, it's written H-LL, but it's L. Poor Jim Bowie burst into tears when he saw me, and I had to take him on my knee and convince him that I was not mortally wounded. Sol Ross called me old gollywog until I caught him and sat on him. Lamar snickered and even Harry smiled. There was nothing I enjoyed more than being a source of amusement to my brothers. Sayus. I didn't sleep well that night on my lumpy rags. I woke up sluggish and cranky the next morning. Mother decided it was pointless to finish my hair before we got to Lockhart, so I suffered the further indignity of having to wear an enormous ruffled cap over the rags all the way there in the ragged. My head was huge. I looked deformed. I looked like Lula Gates' brother. Poor old feeble-minded Toddy Gates, who had water on the brain. Questions for the notebook. Where did the water on Toddy's brain come from? Did Mrs. Gates drink too much while carrying him? I prayed that we wouldn't meet anyone I knew, and then felt guilty for drawing God's attention away from serious matters to what was, after all, only an item of vanity. I admit I got more nervous the closer we got to Lockhart, but Harry kept telling me it would be a cakewalk. We pulled up to the hall, and as the horses came to a stop, I leaped from the wagon and ran around to the back door before I could draw a crowd. Mother and Viola followed behind with a basket full of hairpins and ribbons and tongs. They parked me on a stool and set to work on me, yanking the rags from my head. There were several other girls being tortured in the same way, so it wasn't as bad as I had feared. Mrs. Ogletree even primped her boy, Georgie, whom she gathered up in a green velvet little Lord Fauntleroy suit. He turned with excitement on his stool, his blonde sausage curls bouncing on his cambric collar. Lula trembled and clutched a tin bucket to her chest and looked like she was going to be sick at any moment. The identical twins, Hazel and Hannah Dauncey, I don't know, were an interesting and identical shade of grayish green. The sight of all this obvious distress in the others perked me up. Miss Brown swept in wearing a new and unbecoming chartreuse I'm just gonna start over. Miss Brown swept in wearing a new and unbecoming chartreuse gown and clapped her hands for attention. Children, Mothers, attention, s'il vous plaît. Instantly there was complete silence. There was not a peep, a squeak, a rustle, not even from the squirmy Georgie. I realized that Miss Brown had the same threatening hold over all her other pupils as she had over me. Why? I thought. Why? I thought. I bet she smacks all of us. Probably not Harry, but everybody else. So it's not just me. Well, how about that? In 10 minutes you will line up, Miss Brown said, from youngest to oldest, and then you will file into the auditorium behind me in an orderly fashion. You will then sit in the row of chairs along the back of the stage until it is your turn to play. There will be no talking, there will be no fidgeting, and there will especially be no pushing. Do I make myself clear? Mute nods all around. Do not forget to bow or curtsy after your selection. Mothers, 10 minutes. And she turned and swept out, kicking her train behind her in one practice motion. Viola and Mother both fell on me again with a vengeance, beating and thrashing my hair with brushes and tongs. Finally they stepped back to admire their work. There, said Mother. Don't you look a picture. I wouldn't have recognized you. Look. She handed me a mirror. I wouldn't have recognized me either, what with the elaborate structural piles teetering on my head. Above my forehead rose a steep cliff of hair, which then swooped into an intricate pointy arrangement at the crown, all massed up above triple pontoons of hair along each temple. Bringing up the rear was a trailing cascade of fat curls down my back. Sorry. This magnificence was topped off with the world's largest pink satin bow. Mother and Viola looked well pleased. They didn't bother to ask me what I thought, so I didn't have to say that I thought I looked appalling. See how pretty you look? Said Mother. My hand drifted up to my hair. Don't you touch that, said Viola. Don't you dare. She gathered up their tools while Mother struck up a conversation with Mrs. Gates. Sip of water. I sidled over to Lula and whispered, Hey, Lula, are you alright? She looked at me with her enormous hazel eyes and nodded, but couldn't, speak. I noticed with envy that she had escaped drastic. I noticed with envy that she had escaped drastic coiffuric ministrations. Her pale, silvery blonde hair hung down her back in two neat braids. I tried to jolly her out of her panic. I nudged her and whispered, Lula, look at what they did to my hair. It's the worst, isn't it? Lula's lips were clamped together. She responded with a long, quivering breath through her nose. I had the feeling she didn't remember how to speak English. Lula, I said, you'll be alright. You've played that piece a million times. Take some more deep breaths. And if that doesn't work, well, you've always got your bucket. I looked around. Harry stood before a mirror in the corner, dousing himself with lavender pomade and painstakingly parting his hair with a comb over and over. I had never known him to take such care with his appearance before. As the oldest student, he would play last, but he would have to sit on stage and suffer through the rest of us until it was his turn. Miss Brown returned, and we received final admonishments from our mothers before they hurried out. My last whispered instructions were from Viola. Don't touch that hair. I mean it. We lined up in silence. No one talked or fidgeted or pushed. Harry winked at me from the back of the line. Lula quaked in front of me, shivering all the way to the tips of her braids. Lula, said Miss Brown, frowning, you have to put that bucket down. Lula didn't move. Calpurnia, take that bucket from her. I tapped Lula on the shoulder and said, Give it over, Lula. It's time. She stared at me in mute appeal. I ended up prying it from her damp hands. Miss Brown said, "Children, this is the time for your very best deportment. Chins up, chests out." She opened the side door to the auditorium, and we marched in behind her to what sounded like hard rain on a tin roof. It was applause, and Lula flinched like a startled fawn. For a moment, I thought she would bolt. I did a rapid and complex series of mental calculations about the range of possible blame that could be assigned to me if she got away, but good old Lula stuck it out and stayed in line. Then I saw Miss Brown floating majestically upward at the front of the line. Why? How? What was happening? It took me a second to remember that there were a dozen or so steps up to the stage, and she was walking up them. Steps! I'd forgotten there were steps! Hundreds of steps! Oh dear. I had seen them before, but they were not part of my mental practice. I hadn't practiced them in my mind's eye. My ankles went wobbly, and I felt hot and cold all over. Lula glided upward in front of me without any apparent problem. I followed in terror and somehow made it up to the top without falling on my face, and then stopped myself just in time from staring into the dazzling limelights that marked the edge of the precipice. We made it to our chairs, and the applause died down like a passing storm. Miss Brown walked to the edge of the stage and curtsied to the audience. She gave a small speech about this splendid occasion, about culture making inroads in Caldwell County, oh yes, and how young minds and fingers benefited from exposure to the great composers, and how she hoped the parents there would appreciate her hard work in molding their children to value the finer things in life, since we were still living, after all, almost at the edge of the wild frontier. She sat down to more applause, and then we got up, one by one, in varying states of misplaced confidence or paralyzing terror. Do I need to tell you what happened? It was a massacre. Do I have to tell you that Georgie fell backward off the piano stool before he played a single note, and had to be hustled off, railing in his mother's arms? That Lula played flawlessly, and then got violently sick the second she finished? That Hazel Dauncey's foot slipped off the pedal in the dead silence before she began, filling the auditorium with a deep reverberating spoing? That Harry played well, but kept looking out at a certain part of the audience for no good reason that I could tell. That I played like a wind-up clockworks with wooden fingers and forgot to curtsy until Miss Brown hissed at me. I don't remember much more about the day. I managed to blot it out, but I do remember vowing in the wagon on the way home that I would never do it again. I told Mother and Father this, and there must have been something in my voice, because the next year, despite Miss Brown's formidable efforts, I handed out the programs along with Lula, who was barred for life from playing in the recital. And that was chapter 6. Gonna take a drink of water. Chapter 7. Harry gets a girlfriend. A quote from The Origin of Species. Domestic races of the same species often have a somewhat monstrous character. They often differ in an extreme degree in some one part. End quote. Shortly after the piano recital, danger entered our lives and stalked my family. Uh-oh. I must have dimly realized that Harry would marry one day and have a family of his own, but I reckoned it wouldn't happen for decades at least. After all, Harry already had a family, and we were it. I, especially, was it. His own pet. Aw. Okay. For some days after the debacle in Lockhart, he'd been acting odd. He stared off into space with a dumb mooncalf look on his face that made you want to slap him. He didn't answer when spoken to. In fact, he seemed barely present. I had no idea what was going on, but this was not my dear, clever Harry. No, this was some dilute, watery version of him. I called into him on the porch and said, Harry. Hmm? Harry, what's wrong with you? Are you sick? What's the matter with you? Hmm, he said, and smiled. Do you feel alright? Should you see the doctor? Don't worry about me. I'm fine. Grant, I feel grand, he said. Then what is it? He smiled mysteriously and pulled a much-handled carte de visit from his pocket. It was one of the new kind with a photographic portrait on it. The height of vulgarity, according to Mother. No, no. Picture. And there she was. A young woman, certainly no longer a girl, with big, protuberant eyes, a fashionably small, squinchy mouth, a long, slender stalk of a neck, and such a great quantity of hair massed above it that she looked like a dandelion puff before the wind decapitated it. Isn't she a corker? He said, in a congested voice I had never heard before and hated instantly. I hated her instantly, too, for I saw her plain for what she was, a hag, a stooping harpy, feasted on the flesh of my beloved brothers, the destroyer of my family's happiness, of my happiness. I stared at this apparition. A corker, I said, reeling. My brother was evaporating before my eyes, and I had to find a way of stopping this dreadful abduction. My thoughts scattered in all directions like undisciplined troops facing their first fire, and it took me a moment to marshal them. But before my first skirmish, I needed some intelligence. Where did you meet her, Harry? I said, innocent as any spy. For a second, the glaze passed from his eyes and he faltered. I'd struck some tender tissue, but I didn't understand its import. Why, I stopped off at the supper on the grounds of Prairie Lee the other night. They saw me on the road and invited me to visit for a piece. Ah, now there are two churches in Prairie Lee. The Baptist Church, which was acceptable, and the Independent Church of Prairie Lee, which was not. The local Leapers were considered a low and trashy lot by many people. These included my parents, who were both robust Methodists. Granddaddy had declared he'd had enough sermons to last a lifetime, and now chose to spend his Sunday mornings tramping across the fields. Reverend Barker, who enjoyed Granddaddy's company, seemed to take it in stride. It was only Mother who was embarrassed. And although Mother had once or twice entertained leapers in the house, she tended to lump them all together, fairly or not, with snake handlers, fallers, foamers, and other fringe examples of the henhouse sense. A part of my mind I had no idea I possessed until that moment took over, and like a great general called all to order. I primed my weapons, surveyed the terrain, and picked my target. I could see the battle ahead in time and space. I was a great Stonewall. I was General Lee himself. The Baptist Church, Harry? I said, sweet as pie. No, he hesitated. She belongs to the Independent Church of Prairie Lee. Blessed relief flooded through me. The enemy was mine. Oh, Harry, I said, all sisterly concern. She's a leaper? That's right. So what? He said, mulishly. God, that's a hard word to say. And don't call them that. They're independent. Have you told mother and father? I said. Um, no. He looked edgy. My opening salvo had hit its mark. Then he looked down at the picture, and I watched him go all sappy again. How old is she? I asked, forging ahead. She looks kinda old. She's not old, he said with indignation. She only came out 5 years ago. I added 5 to 18, the typical age for coming out, and came up with the usual result. She's 23, I said, aghast, and secretly jubilant. She's practically an old maid. Besides, you're only 17. That makes no difference, he said. He plucked the card from my hand and huffed off. At dinner that night, Harry mentioned that he might hitch Ulysses to the gig and take him out for exercise. Why don't you ride him? Said father. You don't need the gig. He hasn't been in harness for a while. It would do him good, said Harry. Time to fire off my next round. In a loud voice, I said, "Are you going to see her?" The table thought The table thought this an interesting inquiry and grew still. Everyone except Granddaddy stopped eating and stared at Harry with interest, even the boys who were too young to understand what was going on. Mother swiveled her head, looking first at me and then at Harry. Granddaddy went on, placidly addressing his beefsteak. Harry flushed and cut me a look to let me know he'd settle with me later. He'd never glared at me like that before. There was something close to hatred in that look. Fear shot through me. I broke out all over in hot prickles. And who is her? Granddaddy's knife screeched across his plate. He patted his mustache with the big white linen napkin that flowed down his chest. He said mildly to his only daughter-in-law, "Good God, Margaret, that's who is she, not who is her. The verb to be never takes an object. Surely you know that by now?" He peered at her and said, "Why, how old are you, Margaret? I reckon you must be close to 30. Old enough to know better, I should think," he said, and turned his attention back to his dinner. My mother, aged 41, ignored this. "Harry," she said. She gave him the gimlet eye. The prickles racing across my skin coalesced into itching pink welts. Our family's future hung by a thread. There's a girl, a young lady, at the Prairie Leap picnic tonight that I'd like to take for a short drive, ma'am. Harriet stammered. Only a short one. Her name. And, said Mother in a frosty voice, who is this young lady? Have you met her? Have you met her people? Her name is Miss Minerva Goodacre. Her people are in Austin. She's spending the month with her aunt and uncle in Prairie Lea. And they are, said Mother. The thread pulled taut. Reverend and Mrs. Goodacre, said Harry. And are you referring to the Reverend Goodacre of the Independent Church of Prairie Lea? Said Mother. The thread creaked and frayed. Yes, said Harry, flushing deeper. He pushed himself away from the table and bolted from the room, falling over his shoulder with false cheer. So it's all right then. I won't be late. Father looked at Mother and said, "What was that all about?" Mother noticed the rest of us sitting open-mouthed and snapped, "You are so obtuse sometimes, Alfred. We'll discuss it later." Sitting next to me, Saul Ross, who was swift for his age, broke into a chant. "Harry's got a girl. Harry's got a girl." At this point, Mother looked volcanic. I hissed, "Shut up, Sully," and elbowed him viciously in the short ribs. Out of the blue, Granddaddy said, "About damn time, too. That boy was starting to worry me. What's for dessert?" One of the interesting things about Granddaddy was that you couldn't always tell if he was present or not. Dinner dragged on forever. Whatever we had for dessert, it was ashes in my mouth. When San Juana came in to clear the table, Mother said, "You are all excused, except for Calpurnia." The others trooped out while I hunkered down at my place. Father lit a cigar and poured himself a larger than usual glass of port. Mother looked like she badly wanted one and rubbed her temples. "Now, Calpurnia," she said, "what is it you know about this young lady?" I thought of the way that Harry had glared at me. "Nothing, ma'am," I said, sounded the retreat, and recalling my battalions as fast as I could. "Come, come. Surely he must have told you something about her." "I don't know anything," I said. "Stop this, Calpurnia. How did you find out about her? And what is happening to your face? You look all blotchy." "Harry showed me a visiting card, that's all." "That's all," I said. "A card?" My mother's voice rose. "She has a card? How old is she?" "I don't know anything," I said. Mother looked at father and said, "Alfred, she has a card." My father looked interested but not alarmed. Clearly the significance of this fact escaped him. My mother got up and started pacing. She, of, she is of yeah. She is of an age to have a card, and my son has been calling on her without telling us. He has been courting her, and we have never even met her. She's a leap. She's an independent, Alfred. Mother railed on me. She is an independent, isn't she? Tell me, Calpurnia. I don't know anything. Ach, you useless child. Go to your room and don't say a word of this to anyone. Are you breaking out in hives? Do you fall in the nose again? Get some baking soda and make a compress." I slipped from my chair and hurried to the kitchen. I always sat at her table, taking a short rest, while San Juan pumped water in preparation to start on the mountain of dishes on the counter. "Mother sent me for baking soda," I mumbled. "Good Lord," said Viola, when she saw my complexion. "How'd you get like this?" "Like that, but okay, I misspoke." "Nuddles," I lied. "I just need a compress." Viola squinted at me and opened her mouth to speak, then shut it again. She got up and sprinkled soda on a damp rag and handed it to me without saying a word. San Juan eyed me as if I might be contagious. As I went up the stairs, I could hear my parents' voices in the dining room, my mother's raised in outrage, my father's rumbling in placation. So Ross and Lamar were lying in wait for me on the landing and followed me to my room. "What's going on? What happened to Harry? What's wrong with your face? Tell us." I ran past them to my room and slapped the cooling rag on my tingling cheek. What had I set in motion? What had I set in motion? Something I could no longer control. I was a novice commander, shocked by the destruction my troops had wrought. I lay awake in bed that night, waiting for Harry to come home. The half moon was up, for I heard the creaking of the harness and the crunching of the gig on the gravel drive. I held my breath and listened. The house was suspiciously silent. I imagined mother and father laying in their big mahogany bed with its heavy carvings of cherubs and fruit. They would be wide awake, or at least mother would be. I got out of bed, put on my slippers, and slid around the perimeter of the room, careful to avoid the floorboard in the middle that cracked like a pistol shot. The stairs were also notoriously loud, so I pleated up my white cotton nightgown and slid down the banister as I'd done my whole life. It was fast and quiet transportation, but I misjudged in the dark and braked late and hit the square newel post hard enough to earn myself a nice blue bruise on my behind, but 2 weaker at least. The moon lit my way to the stable. I crept to the door and looked inside. Harry curried Ulysses in the Latin light and hummed a song that I recognized with alerts as "I Love You Truly." He looked so happy, happy in a way I had never seen him look before. "Harry," I whispered. He turned and his face grew hard. What are you doing here? He said. Go away. Go to bed. He went on brushing the horse. Oh, that look. There'd been times in the past where I'd been in some kind of mild trouble with him, and uncomfortable as those times had been, they had always passed. I had basked safe in the knowledge that I was forever his favorite. I took his love on faith and wrapped it around me like a blanket. But this was different. I had fundamentally injured him while trying to protect us. To protect him. No. If I were being honest, to protect myself. And I felt the first icy grip of grief around my heart. Stunned, I backed out of the circle of light and stood alone under the moon. A hiccup, or sob, escaped me. I turned and scrambled back to the house on rubbery legs. I made it through the front door, but then floundered on the bottom stairs. That's where Harry found me half an hour later, a huddled heap of misery in a white nightgown, sniffling in the dark, too upset to move, with only Idabel, who had padded out from the kitchen for company. I could just see him, standing with his hands on his hips. I'm gonna drink the water. I'm sorry, Harry, I whispered. There are some matters in this world that are not for children. They are for grown-ups, he said. I never I had never thought of Harry as a grown-up before. My brothers and I had always been children together. But the way he said the word, I knew at that moment he had crossed some invisible border into a different land, and he would not be returning to our childish band again. I didn't mean to get you in trouble, I moaned. Yes, you did. I don't understand why you would do this to me. I wanted to cry out, for the family, for you. But I knew deep down that it was for me, and I was ashamed. The grandfather clock chimed 3 times in the dark. You should go to bed, he said, in a flat voice. I clung to the fact that these words were, despite their coldness, less harsh than the words he had spoken to me in the barn. Surely it would be all right. He would put his arm around me and take me upstairs and tuck me in. But he did not. Instead, he whispered, I wish you hadn't done that, and walked past me up the stairs, leaving me to contemplate the carnage of my brief command. My campaign had been successful, and it had cost me my brother. It wasn't until the clock on 4 that I could make myself creep up to bed. The next morning I was so exhausted that I stayed in bed, feigning illness and dozing fitfully. It wasn't difficult to convince Mother that I was ill, what with my listlessness and lingering hives. She and Viola sent a steady stream of beef tea and baking soda poultices into my room. Late in the afternoon, there was talk of tonics and purgatives and cod liver oil, but at that point I managed to rally, take some plain boiled chicken, averting such drastic management. Any child who stayed in bed for more than one day in our house was dosed with cod liver oil. The mere prospect of it often wrought a near miraculous recovery. Travis came in to lend me his kitten, Doc Holliday, to cheer me up. Jesse James was indisposed. JB climbed up on the bed and cuddled with me a while to make me feel better. Saul Ross brought me a bouquet of straggly wildflowers for my nightstand, and proudly showed me the mark on his trunk where I'd elbowed him. I didn't show my own much more impressive bruise on account of its indiscreet location. Harry didn't visit. The following morning I staggered down to breakfast. I was relieved to see that Harry at least glanced at me. Before we left the table and scattered for the day, Mother said, We will be having guests Friday evening, so you'll all be ready for inspection at 6:15. Drat, said Granddaddy. Who is it this time? grandfather," said Mother. "We wouldn't dream of imposing on you if you have a prior engagement." Mother knew Granddaddy didn't have a prior engagement, but there was always the siren song of his laboratory or in the library. My mother could only hope. I noticed that she never exactly encouraged Granddaddy's presence at her evening entertainments, or soirees, as he called them. It was always the model of old-fashioned manners, of course, but he could go off on strange and interesting tangents of conversation that I think Mother didn't always find suitable in polite company. Fossils, for example, and whether their existence disproved the book of Genesis, whether Mendel's experiments on the sexual reproduction of the sweet pea, the fallible, eh, the fallacy of laudable pus. Once I had seen my mother shudder on overhearing him expound to a group of ladies on the mating posture of order Opilions or daddy longlegs. Then there were his predictions for the future. How man would one day build flying machines and travel to the moon, prognostications that were met with the sly indulgence afforded old cottagers, although I secretly agreed with them and could imagine it happening 1,000 years hence. It was only 4 years after this book happens that they flew. Oh boy. "Who's coming, ma'am?" said Sam Houston. "The Lockets, the Longorias, Miss Brown, Reverend and Mrs. Goodacre, and a Miss Minerva Goodacre," said Mother, examining her butter knife. Uh-oh. I looked at Harry, who was also interested in his cutlery, studying it as if he had never seen it before. I swallowed hard. What to do? I consoled myself that I had 3 more days to think about it, brooding in my tent like Napoleon. Every time I passed Harry on the stairs for the next few days, I smiled stiffly. He remained impassive. I chose to interpret his not actually scowling at me as a good sign. Friday came and I still had no plan. Instead, I washed and dried my hair. Then I sat at my vanity and glumly counted 100 strokes of the hairbrush. I put on my best lawn dress and kid boots, the ones I had worn to the music recital, and tied a sky blue ribbon in my hair, the color Harry liked best on me. I went downstairs to join the others. Harry looked handsome and reeked of the competing scents of lavender pomade and bay rum toilet water. A, lo- ah, a live undercurrent of excitement fizzed in him, and he softened to the point of giving me a grin. We lined up in the hall by age, Sam Houston gagging as he inhaled the fumes coming off Harry. Mother came down to inspect us. She wore her emerald silk with the short train, one of her best, and the train made a faint wish-wish sound as she walked. She looked at boots, our teeth, our fingernails. "Calpurnia, for heaven's sake," she said. "Stand up straight. What's the matter with you? Jim Bowie, those nails won't do. It looked like you've been grubbing in the garden. Calpurnia, take him and fix him." I led JB off to the bathroom, grateful for something to do. As I scrubbed him, he said, "Is Harry getting married?" This startled me so much that I dropped the nail brush. "Wherever did you get that idea?" "I heard Mother talking about it. Is Harry going away?" "I hope not, JB." "Me too." I worked on him until the first guest arrived, and we had to line up again at the front door. When Miss Brown arrived, I shook her hand and dropped her a deep on ostest. I'm gonna restart that. When Miss Brown arrived, I shook her hand and dropped her a deep, ostentatious curtsy. But I must have overdone it because the old bat gave me a hard smile and said, "Why, hello, Calpurnia. Aren't you just charming as always?" She squeezed my hand so tightly with her own tendi- tenderness claw that I yelped like a trod upon dog. Yes, this evening was off to a marvelous start, and Miss Minerva Goodacre hasn't even arrived yet. I took a silver tray of smoked oysters and offered them around the room, keeping a close count as is instructed by Viola by how many my brothers took. This wasn't too difficult, as the younger boys took one look at the shiny, wrinkled gray sacks and turned away in horror. You couldn't have paid them to put one in their mouths. Harry looked, nah, Harry lurked between the parlor and the hall so that he could watch the front door for the great arrival. Granddaddy appeared with his beard trimmed and his hair plastered down. He sported a pinky red rose in his buttonhole. Except for his moth-eaten coat, he looked almost distinguished. The Longorias arrived, and Travis took the children out to the stable to show off his kittens. I looked around at my family and felt a great wave of tenderness for them. They were all innocents playing out their unsuspecting parts. I wanted to preserve the moment and tuck it away, folded and sealed forever in my memory. Any second, it was about to end. Then Harry rushed to check his hair and tie in the hall mirror once again. I looked out the window and saw Mr. Goodacre tethering his horses. Harry dashed out the front door to hand down two women from the buggy, one stout and one slender. He offered his arm to the slender one, the harpy, and they moved up the walk, their heads together, sharing some word, some laugh, some something that none of the rest of us would ever share. My parents met them at the door, and I could overhear the bright chatter of introductions before Mother led everyone into the parlor. I had to give my mother credit. She appeared more relaxed and cheerful than I would have expected under the circumstances. Maybe she'd taken some tonic. And there she was, taller than I expected, and slender, and dressed in a fussy peach dress with too many jet buttons. There was the petulant mouth, the long neck, the buggy eyes, the massy hair. She carried a spangled peach-colored fan that she opened with a theatrical flop as she met the other guests. I was about to flee to the kitchen when Harry saw me and beckoned me over. Miss Goodacre, may I present to you my sister, Calpurnia Virginia Tate. Callie, this is Miss Minerva Goodacre. The peach fan beat the air like a giant moth. She looked at me with her big buggy eyes and said with a trolling laugh, why Calpurnia, what a sweet little girl you are. So talented, too. I heard you play at the music recital. And with this, she filled her fan and tapped me playfully on the cheek with it a mite too hard. Was I in for such punishment all night long? How do you do, Miss Goodacre? I managed to croak. I am pleased to make your acquaintance. Oh, she said, I am sure we shall be more than acquaintances. Sure we will become fast friends. Now, Harry, where's that Très Maison Grand Pierre that I heard so much about? Gah, she was spouting French. Harry steered her over to Granddaddy, who bowed low over her hand, brushed it with his whiskers, and said, Enchanté, mademoiselle. I think he might have even clicked his heels. She responded with what I guess was supposed to be a musical laugh. My goodness, sir, aren't you just too delightful? And that, as they say, was that. She ignored me for the rest of the evening. Carrying trays of this and glasses of that, I trailed after her and Harry as they circulated about the room. She was given to much fan play. She talked about fashions from Paris and fashions from New York, and wasn't ashamed about the perfectly frightful dress that Governor Culbertson's wife had won to her husband's inauguration in Austin, and surely with all that money she could have afforded better, or at least sought advice from Modeste with taste. This was essentially the point, n'est-ce pas? God, I'm butchering the French. I am butchering this French, I am sorry. And speaking of taste, had anyone else remarked upon that dreadful dowdy number that so and so had worn to such and such ball, blah blah blah. Mother tried to engage her in conversation about music, but she would have none of it. Father tried to extract her opinion about the telephone line that would soon come to town, but she had none. See, she simpered and swished and ordered Harry about. She made me positively sick. The evening wore on. Somehow we got through an interminable dinner, and then for entertainment, Miss Brown sat down at the piano and whipped through her stock party piece, the minute waltz, in 52 seconds by Father's pocket watch. Then she accompanied Miss Goodacre, who sang "Drink to me only with thine eyes," in what I considered to be a completely indifferent voice, all the while emoting heavily in Harry's direction. And this is the song. Drink to me only with thine eyes, and I will pledge with mine. Will leave a kiss within the cup, and I'll not ask for wine. I noticed during this nauseating performance that Granddaddy stared at her as if mesmerized, which depressed me right into the ground. Conquering Harry was not enough. She had to captivate all the men who were important to me. Then Harry sang "Beautiful Dreamer" while Miss Goodacre made googly eyes at him. The hateful Miss Brown pushed me forward to play my recital piece. I had a splitting headache and a false smile plastered on my face, and managed to give a mediocre performance. Then I went to the kitchen to beg a headache pastille from Viola. "What's she like?" said Viola. "She don't look all that pretty from here. And Mr. Harry's such a nice looking boy and all." "She's dreadful, Viola. She can't talk about anything except clothes." "Well, clothes is interesting," said Viola. "Not if that's all you can talk about," I said. "That's true. She ain't much of a singer neither. How's your mama holding up?" "Okay, I guess." "Good," she said. "Here's the pastille. Take these chocolates out there. Keep count." I went back to the party and handed around the chocolates, keeping them away from my brothers as best as I could. San Juana rounded up the younger ones for bed. Reverend Goodacre discussed the vagaries of the cotton market with my father. Granddaddy trapped Harry and Miss Goodacre in the corner and gave them a detailed explanation of the difference between the male and female Danacrida, or giant locust. Miss Goodacre's smile grew fixed. "Come to the library," Granddaddy said to her. "I have an excellent pair of specimens to demonstrate the difference." He took her by the elbow and steered her out of the room. "Bring her back to us soon," Harry called out. "Don't deprive us of her company for too long. Ha ha." Harry radiated bonhomie. I stood there and handed him a chocolate truffle. I wanted my brother to love me again at any price. In a weak voice, I, the world's biggest, fattest liar, said, "She seems very nice, Harry." Welts erupted on my neck. This time they were the hives of hypocrisy. "Yes," he said, she's a grand girl, isn't she? I knew you'd like her once you had a chance to meet her. Good bonbon. Let's have another." Blind, I thought. "You're blind." At that moment, Miss Goodacre burst into the room looking flustered and tense. She bustled up to Mrs. Goodacre, and they conversed in an agitated whisper. Mrs. Mrs. Goodacre turned to the gathering and said, Minerva has a sick headache, and I'm afraid we must get her home. Such a shame for such a lovely party, but her mother has entrusted her to me for safekeeping. I'm sure you all understand. They collected their wraps and made their abrupt good nights while Mr. Goodacre and Harry prepared the buggy. There were many calls of thanks to my mother, but no promises of doing it again soon. They disappeared into the night. Harry looked pensive. Grandfather, did Miss Goodacre seem all right in the library? She seemed well enough. She did display some interest in the gossamer winged butterflies. I wish she had shown more interest in the carrion beetle collection, though. They are, after all, exceptionally fine specimens. He lit up a cigar. All in all, we had a good talk, I'd say. The next day, my mother received hand-delivered thank you letters from my guests and left them out on the dining table to serve as a lesson in good manners to us. The notes were flowery and effusive, except for Miss Goodacre's, which, although correct, was terse to the point of rudeness. 2 days later, Harry tried to call on her. Her aunt informed him that she was not at home. 3 days after that, Miss Goodacre returned to Austin without any notice. Harry found out when he stopped in again, and the Goodacre's maid told him. He came home and took to his room. There was speculation among my older brothers about whether he would be dosed with cod liver oil. If not, exactly how old did one have to be to escape it? Was 16 the cutoff? 14? It was a question of intense interest. Harry did not get dosed with the stinking oil. Instead, he was drenched with confusion and sadness when his letters to Miss Goodacre were returned unopened. He stumbled about the house for days like one of the walking wounded. It was pitiful. I tended my own stupendous bruise through its lurid healing colors and vowed to resign my commission as a meddler. And that was chapter 7. Let's hear my soda pop. Alright. Take a drink of water. Alright. Chapter 8. My sorry, let me do that again. Chapter 8. My crocoscopy. Whatever. A quote from The Origin of Species. The crust of the earth is a vast museum. Blah blah blah. After a nearer brush with the drippy Miss Goodacre, the house stayed discombobulated for weeks as Harry mourned and moped. I did keep my vow not to meddle, too, except for listening at the keyhole when Granddaddy had a talk with Harry in the library a few days later. Something about how the law of natural selection, which always worked in nature, sometimes inexplicably broke down in man. Harry did seem a bit better after that, but it still took a while longer to get our old Harry all the way back. I wondered if Harry blamed our grandfather in some part for showing Miss Goodacre his carrion beetle exhibit. If that's all it took to put her off from my brother, she wasn't worthy of him. I could tell that mother was relieved that the wretched Goodacre had gone. My mother's usual attitude of non-committal formality toward her father-in-law warmed to something approaching gratitude, or maybe even affection. She inquired she inquired about She inquired after his health at dinner, and made sure he got the choicest cuts, although I don't think he noticed. Harry forgave me. After all, I hadn't been able to prevent him from having his main chance with Miss Goodacre. I had put on my best party manners and was above criticism. Whatever happened that night hadn't been my fault. I had given her no cause to flee from the house. Now I was his long-standing favorite, his own pet, the one he had carried piggyback since infancy. I was flooded with relief to find myself his pet again. Methinks there's a little too much affection there. it's my opinion. The summer wore on. Sometimes my father would seek advice from Granddaddy about some aspect or other of the farm or the cotton gin. Father found it difficult to tear his own father away from his study of the natural world and make him focus on some point of commerce. Granddaddy had started the business and made it a success, but now he couldn't be bothered. I found it odd that my parents couldn't understand how Granddaddy could have turned his back on his old life. Ever since he told me about his bet, it made perfect sense to me. I don't have that many days left, he said as we sat together in the library. Why would I want to spend them on matters of drainage and overdue accounts? I must husband my hours and spend every one of them wisely. I regret that I didn't come to this realization until I reached 50 years of age. Calpurnia, you would do well to adopt such an attitude at an early age. Spend each of your allotted hours with care. Yes, sir, I said. I'll do my best. There was no chair for a guest, so I sat on the slanting footstool, apparently a camel saddle. Didn't look like any saddle I had ever seen, but it had a funny smell and was covered in lots of little beige hairs similar to a chihuahua's, so I guess it was real. I never tired of looking at Granddaddy's things. His brass spyglass from the war, wide, wide shallow doors containing rows of desiccated lizards, spiders, and dragonflies. An ornate black cuckoo clock that announced the quarter hours in a dual cat voice. A moldering blue rosette with tarnished print that read, Best Faststock, Printers Fair, 1877. Thick, creamy, parchment-like envelopes from the National Geographic Society affixed with red rat's seals. A carved wooden mermaid holding a pipe rack. Even the bearskin, with its gaping mouth. The number of times I put my foot in that mouth, I can't begin to say. In the locked cabinet on the shelf above the prize book was the gnarly stuffed armadillo, the worst example of taxidermy I had ever seen. Why did it keep this, when all his other specimens were paragons of their species? Granddaddy, I said, why do you have that armadillo? I bet you could buy a much better one. That's true, I could, but I keep it as a reminder. That was the very first mammal I stuffed myself. I learned by a correspondence course, which I advise against. If this path interests you, I suggest you apprentice yourself to a master. There are subtleties to the art that cannot be gleaned from merely reading a pamphlet. I don't think I want to learn taxidermy. I poked at a shelf crammed with fossils and old bits of bone. A wise decision, he said. Smell alone is enough to discourage most novices from persevering. I have to say in my defense that the next armadillo was much better. So much better, in fact, that I sent it off to the great man himself as a token of the high esteem in which I held him. I was hefting a trilobite fossil and half listening. I was fascinated by the ordered ridges of stone that had once been the soft body of a sea animal. He had made a study of the South American armadillo, so I thought he should have a North American sample as well. After the armadillos, I took on a bobcat, which I'll admit now was far too ambitious. I found the facial features quite difficult. I was trying to reproduce the snarl of the cat when it was disturbed in the wild. The poor creature ended up looking as if it had the mumps. How many million years old was the stonified creature I'd held in my hand? What ancient sea had it swimming? I had never even seen the ocean. I can only imagine the waves, the wind, the brine. Fine. Anyway, as a thank you, the great man sent me the belled beast you see on the shelf next to the armadillo. It is my most prized possession. Excuse me, I said, looking up from the trilobite. The bald beast you see there on the shelf. I looked up at the monster in the thick glass carboy with its freakish eyes and multiple limbs. It is a sepia officinalis he collected near the Cape of Good Hope. Who collected it? We are speaking of Mr. Darwin. We are? I couldn't believe it. He sent you that? Indeed. Over his lifetime, he carried on an extensive correspondence with many naturalists around the world and traded specimens with quite a few of us. Granddaddy, kidding. Calpurnia, I would never kid. And for once, your mother and I are in agreement on this important point. The use of slang is an indicator of a weak intellect and an impoverished vocabulary. Okay. I couldn't believe it. We had not just his book in our house, but a monster collected by Mr. Darwin himself. I stared at the thing and tried to make sense of its too many arms and legs. What is it? What do you think it is? I made a face of exasperation. You sound like mother telling me to look up a word in the dictionary when I don't know how to spell it. Good. Another point of agreement. I edged up to the jar and tried to read the small paper tag hanging from a string around the around the neck of the bottle. The writing was old-fashioned and faded. I couldn't read it, but it was a thought just to know that Mr. Darwin had written it with his own pen in his own hand. Can I take it out of the jar? It's hard to see, what with it being all squashed in there. It is almost 70 years old and preserved in spirits of wine. I'm afraid it will disintegrate if we remove it. I peered at it. Land, sea, or air. Although there were many limbs, they looked rubbery and not substantial enough to bear any weight, so it had to be a swimmer. Sea, then. Except there were no fins. How could it swim without fins? A problem. And I couldn't see any gills. Another problem. The eyes were oversized saucers. Why did they need to be so big? Answer? See in the dark, of course. It had to live in areas of low light, which meant deep water. I said, it is some kind of fish, and it lives near the bottom of the ocean. It's unlike any other kind of fish I'd ever seen. I don't know how it locomotes or how it breathes. As far as you go, you are correct. It's unfair to expect you to surmise more, because it is, as you say, squashed in there. It is a cuttlefish. Aww. The family is Zepida, the genus is Sepia. It locomotes by pulling water into a cavity in the mantle and squeezing it through a muscular siphon. The mantle also hides the gills. When startled by a predator, it releases a cloud of brownish black ink to obscure its escape. We use the calcified internal shell as an abrasive. Owners of captured birds sometimes give them the shell on which to sharpen their beaks. The thing fascinated me. It was a piece of history as well as an oddity. I touched a finger to the cool glass. I later mentioned to Harry how interesting I found the bottled beast. Startled, he looked up from the book he was reading and said, "You've been in the library?" "Yes," I said, and added, "Granddaddy invited me." "Oh, well, in that case, did you notice the ship in the bottle?" I think that's the most interesting thing, although I haven't had a chance to get a good look at all his things. He got it from the volunteer fire department years ago when he gave them money and bought the pump wagon. I hoping I'm hoping he'll leave it to me in his will. He looked at me curiously. You seem to be spending a lot of time with him. Sometimes. What do you and that old man talk about? This made me wary. Harry didn't so much worry me, but what if the younger brothers discovered that Granddaddy was a trove of weird and fascinating facts about Indian fighting, the larger carnivores, hot air ballooning? I'd never have him to myself again. Um, things, I said, and flushed. I hated withholding anything from Harry. He turned back to his book, and I kissed his cheek. He stroked my hair absently. You're still my own pet, right? That's right, I declared. I am. That is a bit weird for me, but okay. It didn't occur to me that others in my family also noticed I spent time with Granddaddy until Jimbo said, "How come you play with Granddaddy more than you play with me, Callie?" That's not true, JB. I play with you lots. And besides, Granddaddy and I aren't playing. We're doing science, I said, realizing as I spoke how pompous I sounded. What's that? It's when you study the world around you and you try to figure out how it works. Can I do it too? Maybe you can when you get to be my age. JB thought about this and said, I don't want to. He's scary, Callie. He hardly ever smiles, and smiles real funny. It was true. Granddaddy smelled like wool, tobacco, mothballs, and peppermint, and sometimes whiskey. JB went on. He's not very jolly. My friend Freddie has a jolly grandpa. What's our other grandpa? Don't we get two? Freddie has two, so how come we don't have two? The other one died before he came along. Caught typhus and then he died. Oh, he thought about this. Can we get another one? No, JB. Well, yes, you can, but whatever. First he was Mother's father, and then later he caught typhus and died. JB looked perplexed by the idea that his own mother had once been a child herself. Why can't we get another one? It's hard to explain, JB. One day you'll understand, I said. Okay. Whenever I told him this, instead of becoming infuriated like Sir Ross, he always accepted it on faith. He put his arms up for a kiss. Who's your favorite sister? I said. You are, Calaby. He giggled. Oh, JB. I breathed into his silky hair, overcome by his sweetness. What? Ah, nothing. I'll play with you more often, okay? I did mean it when I said it. Okay. But I had so much work to do following that singular day when, floating in the river and looking at the sky, I'd been struck by a thunderbolt of understanding about grasshoppers and, really, the world itself. By the time I'd clambered up the river bank, I'd been transformed into an explorer, and the first thing I discovered was another member of my own odd species living at the other end of the hall. There was a living treasure under our roof, and none of my brothers could see him. Who the hell just messaged me? Oh, that's just a notification. Are you coming, Calpurnia? Granddaddy called. Yes, sir. Coming. I galloped down the hall into the library with a fishing creel over my shoulder. It was an old wicker one of Granddaddy's, with hardly any fishy smell left. It was full of my notebook, collecting jars, a cheese sandwich, a quart bottle of lemonade, and a waxed paper twist of pecans. I thought we'd use the microscope today, he said, securing it in its case and nestling it in his haversack. It's an old one, but the lenses are nicely ground and still in good condition. I expect you have I expect you have newer ones at school. A microscope was a rare and valuable thing. We had no microscopes at school. I was willing to bet I was looking at the only one between Austin and San Antonio. We don't have any at school, Granddaddy. This gave him pause. Is that so? I don't understand the modern educational system at all. Neither do I. Neither do I. We have to learn sewing and knitting and smocking. In the department, they make us walk around the room with a book on our heads. Granddaddy said, I find that actually reading the book is a much more effective way of absorbing it. I laughed. I'd have to tell you, Lula, that one. What are we going to study today? I asked. Let us examine pond water for algae. Van Leeuwenhoek was the first man to have seen what you will today. He was a wool merchant. He was a wool munch. He was a wool merchant, much as I was a cotton merchant. He smiled. So, you see, there is something to be said for the inspired amateur. What he saw was unimaginable. I remember well my first look. It was like falling through the lens into another world. Do you have your notebook? There will be much to record. Got it. We walked to the river. On the way, we stirred up a herd of deer that crashed away through the underbrush and disappeared in 2 seconds flat. This, of course, raised the subject of deer and something Granddaddy called the food chain in each animal's place in the natural order. We came to a shallow-blind inlet, ringed by a thick fringe of mossy green growth. The cooler air and stagnant water smelled of mud and rot. Frantic tadpoles zigzagged away from our shadows. Some good-sized creature splashed into the water upstream from us, an otter, maybe, or a river rat. A pair of swallows rushed by, skimming for insects a few inches above the water. We set down our satchels, and Granddaddy unpacked the microscope and assembled the barrel and the lenses, each of which had a cunning nesting piece in the velveteen-lined box. He showed me how the pieces fit together. Here, you do it, he said. The brass cylinder felt cool and heavy in my hands. I knew I was being trusted with something precious. Then he placed the case on a flat rock and balanced the microscope on top of it. Now, he said, handing me 2 thin pieces of glass. Choose any droplet of water. Any droplet? I asked. Any one will do. There are so many to choose from, I said. He smiled. You'll see more interesting things the closer your sample is to the Green River plants grown here. I bent and dipped my fingertip into the water, picking my droplet, then let it fall on one piece of glass. He instructed me to put another slip of glass on top. Now place it here on the platform, he said. That's right. The tricky part is to turn this reflector so that it catches the sunlight at the best angle. You want enough light to illuminate your subject, but not so much that the details get washed out. I fumbled with the reflector and put my eye to the barrel, sure that something momentous was about to appear. What I saw could only be described as a field of pale gray fog. It was supremely disappointing. Granddaddy, there's nothing here. Take the focus knob here. He took my hand and slowly turned it away from you. No, don't look up. Keep looking while you turn. An awkward exercise. Do you have enough light? He said. Don't forget your reflector. Then it happened. A teeming, swirling world of enormous wriggling creatures burst into my vision, scaring the daylights out of me. Ook! I cried, and jumped back, almost overturning the whole apparatus. Ew. I swear that's what it says in the book. Ew. I said, steadying the microscope. I looked up at Granddaddy. I take it you saw your first microscopic creatures, he said, smiling. Plato said all science begins with astonishment. My goodness, I said, and looked through the eyepiece again. Something with many tiny hairs rode past at high speed. Something else with a lashing tail whipped by, a tumbling barbed spear like a medieval mace rolled past. Delicate, filmy, ghost-like shadows flitted in and out of the field. It was chaotic. It was wild. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. This is what I swim in? I said, wishing I didn't know. What are these things? That's what we'll find out. Perhaps you could Perhaps you should sketch a few of them so we can identify them later from the text. Sketch some, but they're moving so fast. In truth, it's a challenge. Here's a pencil. I perched next to the scope and looked and sketched as best I could. After a while, I noticed that some of the creatures started reappearing, which made drawing them easier. Granddaddy hummed Vivaldi and putted nearby with his straining net. I chewed my pencil and found out my artwork, which consisted of awkward, blobby forms scattered across the page. I'm sorry to say that these aren't much good, I said, showing my page to Granddaddy. As artwork goes, you are entirely correct in your appraisal. But the more important point is this. Are these representations true enough so that you can match them with the examples in the atlas once we get back to the library? If that is the case, then you have done an acceptable job. I think I might be able to tell, I said, but I'm not sure I can ever swim in the river again. All these creatures are completely harmless, Calpurnia, and they have enjoyed the river for many more eons than you. In addition, console yourself with the thought that you swim in the river proper, and these animals are not happy in flowing water. Alright, I said, but still. The bushes rustled, and Father's dog Ajax trotted up, pleased with himself for having found us. He had no doubt been out courting Matilda, Mr. Gates' blue tick hound, she of the unique yowling cry that could be heard all over town. He greeted us in turn, nose enough for a pat, then splashed into the shallows and slurped at the brackish water. A fist-sized turtle plopped off a fist-sized turtle plopped off a rotting log, and Ajax charged clumsily after it. He enjoyed the game of chasing turtles and other small river creatures, but I'd never seen him actually catch anything aquatic. He was, more properly, a specialist in avian studies, but this time he surprised me by ducking his whole head underwater and coming up, startled, with an equally startled turtle in his mouth. Ajax, I said, what are you doing? Stop it. Put that back where it belongs. He pranced back to us, pleased with himself, and dutifully laid the turtle at our feet before shaking water all over us. He sat and looked up at me expectantly. He thinks he's doing his job, said Granddaddy. You had better praise him, or all your father's training will be for nothing. Oh, Ajax. Good boy, I guess. I gave him a pat. What are we going to do with your turtle? Travis already has one in his room, and I doubt that Mother will tolerate another. Perhaps you should hold his collar while I let this one go? I'll walk him up the bank, said Granddaddy. He shouldn't see you letting it go, or he will come to question the purpose of his work and eventually grow disheartened. He led Ajax away, and when they were both out of sight, I inspected the turtle. Why had it allowed itself to be captured by such a large, dumb land creature? Was it old? Was it sick? There was nothing obviously wrong with it. It looked like every other turtle in the river. Maybe it was simply stupid. Maybe it was better that it died so that it wouldn't produce more generations of stupid baby turtles. But too late, I'd interfered and thus made myself responsible for its safety. Wondering if I was, in my own small way, promoting the survival of the unfittest, I pushed it into the water, where it disappeared in a wink. It's alright, I yelled over my shoulder. You can let him go. I climbed up the bank after them, and Ajax met me at the top, sniffing at me for his turtle. It's gone, I said, showing him my empty hands. See? I swear he understood me because his ears drooped, and he turned away. It's gone, Ajax, I'm sorry. Come here and be a good dog. I ruffled his coat and thumped his sides the way he liked, even though I knew I would sink like a red dog for the rest of the day. There's a good boy. You're a good boy. This cheered him up some, and he forgave me enough to walk with me while we caught up with Granddaddy. Ajax found the biggest burrow I'd seen in a long while. It looked and smelled like a badger's hole, and badgers were getting rare in our part of the world. He amused himself by sticking his muzzle deep inside and sniffing in excitement. What do you see there? I called out to Granddaddy, who peered with interest at a small, uninteresting plant. Come on, Ajax. I hauled on his collar and to keep him from losing the end of his nose to a swipe from the burrow's notoriously irritable tenant. Vetch, said Granddaddy. It looks like hairy vetch, but it may be a mutant. It's got this odd dependent leaf at the bottom. He pinched off a couple of inches of stalk and handed it to me. Let's save that one. A boring plant, but I put it in a jar and printed hairy vetch mutant on the label. He said, I've also got a woolly caterpillar over here. Have you ever raised one of these? He held up a twig on which squirmed the biggest, fuzziest caterpillar I'd ever seen, a good 2 inches long. Or, more properly, 5 centimeters. Granddaddy had told me that true scientists use the continental system, which would soon come into widespread use in America. It did not. The caterpillar was covered in dense fur that looked as plush and inviting as a cat's pelt, but I knew better than to stroke it. I'd been told my whole life that woolly caterpillars would sting you badly. I just didn't know if it was a little badly or a whole lot badly. Whole lot badly. What kind is he? I asked. I'm uncertain about the species, it said. There are several that look alike to the naked eye, and you can't know what you've got until it emerges as a ringed imago. He said, I suppose you could. Eh, no. So how bad is the sting? He said, I suppose you could touch him and find out, which raises an interesting point. How far are you willing to go in the name of science? This is something for you to ponder. Well, maybe. Or maybe I could give one of the younger boys a penny to touch it for me. But then I'd consider the price I'd have to pay later with Mother. Definitely not worth it. Let's take him home, and I'll raise him, I said. I think I'll call him Petey. Calpurnia, you will find it a bad idea to give names to your experimental subjects. Why? I said, dropping Petey and his trig into the biggest mason jar we had, quart-sized, with holes punched into the lid. It tends to spoil the truly objective observation. I'm not sure what that means, Granddaddy. But he was lost in thought over some animal tracks. Thoughts, I think, he murmured, with a couple of kits by the look of it. That's encouraging. I thought the coyotes had gotten them all. By the time we got back to the house, we found that Sam Houston and Lamar had brought home a startling catfish that weighed 45 pounds on the gin scale. Its huge, frowning mouth was framed with lasting barbels as thick around as pencils. It was a fright to look upon. The biggest of these fish didn't fight the hook much, so my brothers did not count them good sport. The main challenge was hauling them out of the river and lugging them home without touching the poisonous spines on their fins. That night we had big chunks of it for dinner, boiled in cornmeal and deep fried. Its white flesh still tainted with the undertaste of mud that didn't seem to bother anybody else. I didn't want to eat it. I didn't even want to see it. It was as big as JB. I mean, the size of that thing. It was big enough to take my whole leg in its mouth, and me swimming in the river every day. I pictured it grabbing me and dragging me down to the bottom, holding me there too long, or maybe long enough, depending on whether you looked at it from my perspective or the fish's. My family would find me later, my hair swirling about like tragic Ophelia's. Or maybe they wouldn't find enough good-sized pieces to justify the cost of a funeral. Maybe they would only find my chemist. Do you have a casket and a ceremony for just for a chemist? Probably not. But how about a limb? And hadn't General Jackson's arm been given a full funeral ceremony? Or how about a head? Guess a head would do it. With that, I decided I had analyzed the matter enough and did my best to think no more about it. Still, for months after that, when I stepped into the river, I thought of that leviathan at one end of the scale, waiting to mutilate me, and the swarming microscopic creatures at the other end, waiting to insinuate themselves. It was too bad, but sometimes a little knowledge could ruin your whole day, or at least take off some of the shine. That was chapter 8. I'm going to take a small break to go to the bathroom. Alright, I'm back. I am back. Let's get into it. Chapter 9 Petey. A quote from The Origin of Species. Peculiar, peculiarities in the silkworm are known to appear at the corresponding caterpillar or cocoon stage. Unquote. Okay, that's blah blah blah. As the summer wore on, I spent more and more time studying science and less time practicing the piano. This turned out to be unwise in the long run, since each time I missed practice, I had to make up the time and pay for it with an extra half hour. On Sunday, after playing for a whole 2 hours, and then an exclamation point in parentheses, I made my escape with my notebook and tapped on the library door. Enter, if you must, Granddaddy called out. He was examining some plates in the Atlas of Microscopic Pond Life. So you have finished with your cultural obligations for the day? He said, without looking up. And I realized that with the transoms open, he could, of course, hear me thumping away in the parlor across the hall. I do like the water music, he said, and I hope you won't grow so tired of learning it that you put it aside for the rest of your life. That's the great danger of too much piano practice. I hope Margaret understands that. Mother says I can go back to a half hour tomorrow. Oh, I said, looking at the plates over his shoulders. That's what I do, isn't it? I opened my notebook to the illustrations I had made of the microscopic river creatures. My ancient mace looked like the one in the text. Volvox, I read. It's Volvox. Is that how you say it? That's correct. Such a satisfying form. I admit I have a special weakness for it among all the chlorophyta. Phyta. Chlorophyta. There we go. Look, I said, here's another one. My drawings were up to snuff. I was very pleased with myself. Go ahead and label each of them in your book, Granddaddy said, and note the page in the atlas so you can find them again. I decided to use ink instead of pencil, which made the whole process nerve-wracking. I only ended up with only one tiny blot. Then I said, Granddaddy, what should I feed Petey? Who? He said. Petey, the caterpillar. Calpurnia, must I give you the answer in a spoon like a baby? Surely you can figure it out on your own. Think about the problem. Do you remember where you found him? What sort of tree he was living on? Ah, I said, and went out to find leaves of the same kind we abducted Petey from. That made sense. A caterpillar's job was to eat, so naturally he wouldn't be found wasting his time lounging about on something he didn't like. Petey curled into a fuzzy comma when I put the leaves in a jar. I replaced his narrow twig with a larger branched one for exercise and diversion, should he feel the need. I set his jar on my dresser between the hummingbird's nest and a bowl of tadpoles I was studying. My dresser was getting crowded. A half hour later, when I looked again, Petey was munching on his foliage and seemed happy enough, but with the caterpillar, how could you tell for sure? I checked on him again before bedtime, and he was motionless, stretched full length along his twig. He appeared to be asleep. At least, I hoped he was only asleep. I looked to see if he had eyes, and if they were closed. Both of his ends looked the same, but when I inspected him with a magnifying glass, I found two shiny black dots buried deep in the fur at one end. They had to be his eyes, didn't they? He didn't appear to have eyelids. Question for the notebook. Why don't caterpillars have eyelids? You would think they would need them, spending their days in the sun as they do. Travis inspected him the following morning and raised a good point I hadn't considered when he said, Why did you call him Petey? How do you know he's a boy? I guess I don't, I said. Maybe we'll find out when he hatches. I don't know what kind of butterfly he's going to be either. More questions for the notebook. Do caterpillars come as male or female? Or do they turn into male or female while they're asleep in their cocoons? Granddaddy had told me about the wasp that could opt to be male or female while in a larval stage. An interesting thought. I wondered why human children weren't given that option in their grub stage, say up to age 5. With everything I had seen about the lives of boys and girls, I would definitely choose to be a boy grub. That means you're trans, Calpurnia. In my opinion. Mother disliked Petey's presence but tolerated him because he would eventually turn into something beautiful. Mother yearned for beauty in her life. She supported the Lockhart Chamber Orchestra and took us once a year to the ballet in Austin. It took us half a day to get there on the train, and we would spend the night at the Driscoll Hotel. There we would have ice cream floats at the fountain and afternoon tea in the Crystal Room. Every month she pored over her magazines that came in the mail, the Ladies' Home Journal and McCall's. From these she made patterns, cutting and sewing silk flowers that she arranged in the parlor. Although we had fields of wildflowers blooming in the spring, she never arranged those. Sometimes I would pick a handful of them and put them in a pitcher by my bed. They looked nice, but they were good for only a day or two. Then they didn't so much wilt as disappear. You were left with a vase full of smelly water. Petey disregarded the world around him. In fact, he disregarded everything except the bundles of leaves I brought him daily. He ate and slept, and ate and slept, and in between bouts of eating and sleeping, he ejected many tiny compacted green bales from his hind end. This meant I had to spend part of each day cleaning up his quarters. I hadn't signed up for this, and I soon grew tired of it, but I kept telling myself it would all be worth it when he turned into a magnificent butterfly. He grew unbelievably fat, as thick as a sausage. One day I bought him the wrong kind of greenery, and he sulked and wouldn't eat it. I was ready to jettison him outside for all the trouble he put me to. Plus, he didn't make a very entertaining pet. When I mentioned this to Granddaddy, he chastised me by saying, "Remember, Calpurnia, Petey is not your pet. He is a creature in the natural order of things. While it is easy to be more interested in the higher order animals, and I must confess I myself am guilty of this weakness, doesn't mean we can neglect our study of the lower orders. To do so indicates a lack of purpose and a shallowness of scholarship. So, all for science, I cleaned up caterpillar poop." Then Petey went off his feet again for no good reason. I checked his forage, and it was the right kind, but he wasn't interested. I thought, "You spoiled, sulky caterpillar. I should throw you out on the lawn, and take your chances with the birds and see how you like them, mister." To my surprise, when I woke up the next morning, I found out he had his concern. I found that he had his con. To my surprise, when I woke up the next morning, I found that he had his cocoon well underway. God damn, why was it so hard to read? So he hadn't been pounding after all. He'd been resting up and planning for his labors. I'd come close to throwing out a blameless caterpillar. All day long, he squirted a fine gray thread from his front end, I think, and busily tangled it this way and that, fashioning a messy cocoon with odd bits of thread sticking out here and there. It looked like slapdash work. His knitting was no better than mine, which made me feel some sympathy for him. He slowly sewed him up himself up in his capsule like an Edgar Allan Poe caterpillar. Good night, Petey. Sleep well, I bid him. Petey stirred and then settled one last time in his self-made prison. The, the cocoon didn't move for 2 whole weeks while Petey went about the slow, magical business of rearranging his parts in his sleep. There was something gorgeous and mysterious about it, but it was also somewhat revolting if you thought about it too closely. It made me think of life and death. I had never seen a real, live, dead person. The closest I had come was a daguerreotype of my Uncle Crawford Steele. Oh, hey, it's Steele. Haha. At age 3 of diphtheria, wrapped in swabs of white lace. You could see some of the whites of his sunken eyes, so you knew that he wasn't asleep, that things were not all right. I went to Harry and asked, Harry, have you ever seen a dead person? He said, no. Why are you asking? No particular reason. Where do you come up with these things? You scare me sometimes. Me? Scare you? The thought of me scaring my biggest, strongest brother was laughable. I was thinking about Petey moving his parts around, and that made me think of living things. Which made me think of dead things. So the next time there's a funeral in town, will you take me? Callie, fee! There's nothing creepy about it. It's scientific interest. Becky Medlin looks kind of decrepit to me. How old is he, do you reckon? Why don't you go down the street and inspect his teeth? That's a good one, Harry, but I doubt he has any left. But go soon, don't you think? I passed Becky Medlin every day on my way to and from school. He sat with the other cottages on the gallery of the gin, barking and spitting and interrupting each other's stories of war and griping at each other that no, it had happened that way, it had happened this way, and so on. Baggy's name came from his prodigious use of chewing tobacco and his poor aim at the spittoon. He spat frequently, randomly, mightily. A constant foul, brown rain patted down on the dust around him, and he had to keep a sharp lookout. No one paid the man the slightest attention anymore. Sometimes even they got sick of yakking and turned to dominoes, playing with the old carved set with dots so stained from a million games that they were nearly indecipherable. The tiles the tiles clat pleasantly, and every now and then one of the old men would exclaim, "Ah!" and you knew he had thrown down a particularly good one. So will you take me to Becky's funeral? I said. Harry said, Really, Callie, this isn't very nice talk. I'm not wishing him to die. I'm just curious. Granddaddy says that a curious mind is a prerequisite. Yes, that to a scientific understanding of the world. Fine. But have you done your piano practice yet? Miss Brown comes tomorrow. You sound like mother. No, I haven't done it yet. And yes, I'll do it. Harry, how many years will we have to take lessons? I'm getting tired of it, aren't you? Why don't some of the others take piano for a while? I have better things to do. Better things to do with grandfather, you mean? Yes. I asked you once before and you never answered me. So, what do you talk about with him? Golly, Harry, there's everything to talk about. There's bugs and snakes, cats and coyotes, there's trees and butterflies and hummingbirds, there's clouds and weather and wind, there's bears and otters, although they're getting harder to find around here. There's whaling ships, there's. Alright. The South Seas and the Grand Canyon, the planets and the stars. Okay, okay. There's the principles of distillation. You do know he's trying to turn pecans into liquor, right? Although it's not going so well. But don't say I said so, okay? Got it," said Harry. There's Newton's laws. There's prisms and microscopes. There's Got it, I said. Gravity friction legend. Gravity friction lenses. Enough already. The food chain, the rain cycle, the natural order. Harry, where are you going? There's tadpoles and toads, lizards and frogs. Don't go away. There's something called microbes, germs, you know. I've seen them through the microscope. There's butterflies and caterpillars, which brings us to Petey. Let's not forget about him. Harry? Yeah, that was me when I was younger. I woke in the morning to a tiny scritch scritch sound like the noise a mouse makes in the wall, only it was coming from Petey's jar. It was too dark to see, so I pulled back the curtain and set his jar in the windowsill. His cocoon pitched that way and that. As the room grew lighter, he thrashed and chewed away, and either didn't notice my face pressed up against his jar or didn't care. Finally, he had a good sized hole in one end of his cocoon, and what had once been peaty slowly strained its way out with a mighty effort. There, instead of the lovely bright creature I had imagined, crouched an odd looking, thick bodied butterfly with damp, tightly furled wings. It shook, struggling to uncrimp itself. I could see that it wasn't my PD anymore. I would have to find a new name for it. Something to reflect its long-awaited splendor. Something like Fleur, since it since it lived on nectar, or maybe sapphire, or maybe ruby, depending on the final color of its wings. I left it to its work and went down to breakfast. At the table, I announced, "Petey hatched. He's busy drying off his wings." "Oh, wonderful," said Mother. "What color is he?" "I can't tell yet, ma'am. He's still puckered up, but he definitely needs a new name now that he's not Petey the Caterpillar anymore." "Children," said Mother, "do you have any suggestions?" Sorwas, the 7-year-old, proclaimed, "We should name him. We should name him." He struggled. "Butterfly." "That's nice, dear," said Mother. "How about Belle?" said Harry, "for beauty." Granddaddy said, "You might want to wait and see what it looks like first." I thought this an odd statement, but if anybody knew his butterflies, it was Granddaddy, so I figured he had some reason for making it. "Yes," I said, "let's see what it looks like before we name him, although Belle is a good idea." Soul Ross looked crestfallen, and I said, "And Butterfly's good too, Sully. Maybe I'll call him Belle the Butterfly?" "Is it a him or her, Callie?" said Travis. "No idea," I said, tucking into the flapjacks. "Kindly don't talk with your mouth full," said Mother. After breakfast, I ran up to my room with the three younger boys on my heels, debating what to christen our new charge. There, in all its glory, was Petey, or Belle, stretched wide on his twig, enormous wings filling his jar. He was huge, he was pale, he was fuzzy all over. He was the world's biggest moth. "That sure is a funny looking butterfly," said Sol Ross. "What's wrong with him?" "It's not a butterfly, Sully," said Travis. "It's a moth." "Callie, did you know it was going to be a moth?" Um, I said, taken aback by his size. "Not really." "Gosh, I've never seen one that big," said Travis. "Me neither. He's kind of creepy," said Sol Ross. "Don't you think?" Uh, it's true, he was kind of creepy, but I would never admit it. I had no idea moths could get to be that size. And this one was only a newborn. "What are you going to do with it?" asked Travis. "I'm going to study it, of course," I said. wondering what on earth I would do with this monster. Oh, okay. So what are you going to study? Um, it's eating habits, that sort of thing. It's mating habits. Right. Yep. There's territory, wingspan, things like that. Are you gonna have to touch it? Said Zoroas. I sure wouldn't want to touch it. Maybe not yet, I said. It's barely born. It needs time to get used to things. You better find a bigger jar fast, Callie. Going to bust out of that one. I don't think they come any bigger. Maybe you could let them fly around your room, said Travis. Not likely. Ew, said Zoroas, backing up. I gotta go. Me too, said Travis. Time for school. Hey, I called after them. It's alright, come back here. I'm not gonna let him out. Now what? Petey, or Bell, or whatever it was, flooded in its jar. Sound was dry, ominous, morbid. I got ready for school, trying not to look at it, flinching every time it flapped. I'd have to let it out of that jar. I could see that, but I didn't want to think about it. I spent most of the hours at school trying not to. When I got home, I lingered downstairs and put in some extra piano practice, after which Mother ordered me upstairs to change my pinafore. I dragged myself up to my room and had a sudden spasm of anxiety as I put my hand on the doorknob. What if it had gotten out? Had I tightened the lid on the jar after opening it the last time? What if it was lying loose around the room? Then I caught myself. Calpurnia Virginia Tate, you're being ridiculous. Are you a scientist or aren't you? Come on now. It's only a moth. Alright, that did it. I peered around my door. There it hunkered in the jar, the same as I'd left it, too big to even turn around. It stirred, wings beating against the glass. Petey, I said, what am I going to do with you? I need to figure out what species you are, and I need to find you a bigger home. I pulled Granddaddy's Taxonomy of the Insect World from my bookshelf and turned to the order Lepidoptera. Based on its color and ridiculous size, had to be a Saturnidae of some kind. Differentiating between the most likely possibilities meant examining the specimen's spread rings, but there wasn't room enough in the jar. There was nothing for it. I'd either have to get it a bigger home or let it loose. I stared at it for a while. It wasn't so bad looking once you got used to its freakish size. It did have cute feathery antennae. I had brought it this far. It was stuck in that jar because of me. I couldn't pretend it didn't exist. Alright, Petey, let's go visit Granddaddy and see what he has to say. I picked up the jar at arm's length and carried it downstairs with him pulsating all the way. I ran into Harriet in the hall. He took one look at Petey and said, Good heavens, is that your butterfly? Looks more like an albatross. Ha, I said. Ha. Did you know it would turn into this? He said. Oh, sure, I said breezily. Harriet eyed me and then said, Let me look at him. He's a prize winner, isn't he? If they had an entry for moss at the Fentress Fair, you'd take it, easy. An interesting thought. Along with the classes for hogs and cattle and home preserves, a category for moss. Which naturally led me to remember the pet division for children every year at the fair. Children showed up with their cats and dogs and parakeets, a bunch of boring everyday pets. Why not something more interesting, like, say, a giant moth? Say, Harry, I said, you think I could enter Petey in the pet show? He's not much of a pet, Galloway, he said, laughing. So what? Dovey Medlin showed up last year with her goldfish, Bubbles, who wasn't much of a pet either. It's not as if they have to perform tricks or anything. All they have to do is sit there, and the judges come by and look at them. You'd get some extra points for being different, don't you think? That he would, but it's months away, he said. How are you going to keep him alive? You can't keep him in that jar. Of course not, I said. I'm trying to figure out some housing for him. How long do moths live anyway? Harry said, I don't know. You're the naturalist. I'm guessing for a few weeks. Mother walked out of the kitchen and came to a sudden halt, staring at Petey's jar in disbelief. What is that thing you got in there, Calpurnia? She said, her voice rising. I sighed. This is Petey, Mother. Or, I added with false cheer, you can call him Belle if you like, as if a beautiful name could somehow cloak this grotesquerie. Petey rippled dryly, and my mother took a step back. She couldn't take her eyes off him. What happened to your beautiful butterfly? She said. He turned out to be not so much of a. He turned out to not. He turned out to be not so much a butterfly as a moth. You see, I said, holding the jar out to her. She took another step back. I want you to get it out of here. That's a moth, for pity's sake. Imagine what something that size would do to the woolens. I had forgotten that she and San Juan fought a perennial pitched battle with hordes of small brown moths for possession of our blankets and winter clothes. The trifling weapons of cedar shavings and lavender oil, no match for the ongoing push of nature. It doesn't eat wool, ma'am, I said. At least I don't think it does. It may only eat nectar, or it may eat nothing at all, depending on its species. Some of them don't feed at all in the adult stage. Haven't figured it out yet. Mother raised her hands. Do not, under any circumstances, let that thing loose in here. I want it out of the house. Do you hear me? Yes, ma'am. She pressed a hand to her temple and turned and went upstairs. Harry said, Too bad. I'd have liked to see him in the pet show. Step right up, folks. Come and see Calpurnia Virginia Tate and a giant pet moth. Very funny. Alright, I have to let him go, but I have to show him to Granddaddy first. I went looking for Granddaddy in the library, but he wasn't there. I could go out the front door and around the lawnway to the laboratory and back, or cut through the kitchen and face more revulsion and more explanations on the way. I tucked the jar under my arm and went to the kitchen. Viola took one look at me and said, What you got there? Oh, nothing, I said, and kept moving out the back door. Petey stirred in his jar. I wished he would keep still. I'd grown used to his appearance, but that noise! There was something foreboding and primeval about it. It made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. Granddaddy was stooped over his ledger book when I found him. Hello, Granddaddy, look what I have, I said, holding out the jar to him. My, that is certainly a hefty specimen you have there. I've never seen one so sizable. Have you identified the family it belongs to? I think he must be Saturnidae, or maybe Phrynidae, I said, proud of my pronunciation. What do you plan to do with him? What do you plan to do with him? I was going to enter him in the pet show at the fair, but Harry thinks he won't live that long, and you keep telling me he's not a pet. And Mother wants him out of the house. So that means I can kill him and keep him for my collection, or I can let him go. Granddaddy looked at me. We both looked at Petey, squashed in his jar. He's a handsome specimen, Granddaddy said. You may never see another like him. I know, I found. You did warn me not to name him, but I've raised him this far. I don't think I can kill him. At dusk, when we gathered on the lawn to await the first firefly, my brother stood on the porch while I set Petey's jar in the grass. Granddaddy watched from a rocker and sipped store-bought bourbon. I took the lid off the jar and stood back. For a moment, Peter huddled there without moving. Then he crawled over the lip of the jar and emerged from his glass cocoon. As he wobbled his way onto the grass, Ajax came trotting around the corner of the house. Petey stretched his quivering wings wide. Too late, from the corner of my eye, I saw the dog charge, his ears flapping, thrilled with the prospect of a new game of fetch. Petey pulsed feebly into the air and came to rest a couple feet away, with Ajax closing fast. He was going to swallow my best specimen, my science project, my Petey. Fury boiled within me. Stupid dog! I ran at him and screamed, Ajax, so loud that I startled myself. Who knew that I had that much wind at me? The birds in the trees took flight, and Ajax hesitated. I lunged at his collar. They leaped sideways, thinking it was all in fine new entertainment. He pounced again, and Petey rose again, chest high this time, flapping like an awkward pullet, testing its wings. No, I screamed, and this time Ajax heard a word he recognized. Puzzled, he looked at me with Petey between his front paws. This was all fine sport, wasn't it? His job was to retrieve fine things, wasn't it? I rushed at the dog again, when Petey, with a mighty effort, launched himself in the air, and in that split second was transformed from an ungainly land-bound dweller into something else, a creature of the wind, a citizen of the air. I watched in amazement. Petey looked like he'd been flying forever. Ajax huffed and pulled at his collar, and I let him go. There was no catching that moth now. Wow! Exclaimed my brothers. You did well, Kelly. I thought the moth was a goner for sure. Granddaddy raised his glass in salute as Petey disappeared into the scrub. Later that night, I sat on the front porch by myself as it grew dark, delaying bedtime as long as I could, until all I could see was the last of the white lilies along the front walk. They glowed in the dark like pale miniature stars fallen to earth. Then something whizzed past me through the air, making straight for them, where it set up a commotion, thrashing around inside one flower after another. It sounded like a hummingbird, but I couldn't see it. Did hummingbirds fly at night? I didn't think so. Could it be a nectar-eating bat? I didn't know, and even though I couldn't see for sure, I decided that it had to be Petey. Or at least, I told myself so. I preferred a happy ending. And that was chapter 9. I'm going to end it there. Only 4 chapters this time, but Force is dead. Let us see who is alive.
A bunch of kicks and shit, so we're
uh, hmm. I don't know who to read. So I think I'm just gonna end stream here. Yeah, I'm just gonna end stream. See y'all.